Jan, who invited me to take part in this conference. Actually, I'm a PhD student at Charles University, and the field of my interest, as indicates Sasha, is the history of literature and literary theory. And the topic of my PhD is the reception of Russian formalism in Ukrainian culture in the interwar period. So here I will try to answer to the question of the development of literary theory in Ukrainian culture that was developed within the framework of development of Russian formalism, and actually it had in 20 years a strong relation between literary theory, Marxism, and if we are talking about the 20s of Ukrainian culture, development of Ukrainian culture, we are talking about nationalism. So I try to explore how these three models, pretending to be universalists, how they cooperate, and I prepared a short overview. As I was said, and I suppose that not a lot of people know about the development of Ukrainian literature of this period. So the structure will be the definition of some terms, historical context. I'm sorry if I will tell something common, seems to be common to everybody, but I need to introduce some historical events for you, just to make the context of development of literary theory. Main literary groups, a so-called literary discussion, 1925-1928, announced by Mykola Khmelyovy. That is a very important politicized literary discussions that played a great role in the further development of literature and theory, and I will show the reception of Russian formalism in Ukrainian culture based on three cases. The first case will be the pan-futuristic conception of the new art introduced by Mikhail Semenko. The second case is Ukrainian theoretical works on poetics of 1920s, and the discussion around the Hinbaum's article, The Theory of Formal Method, that appeared in journal Червоный шлях, Red Way, in 1926 and provoked a great discussion among Ukrainian critics, Marxists. So when we are talking about Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture, and interwar period, as usually Ukrainians appeal to this term, Стилянное відродження, executed renaissance, that indicate the generation of Ukrainian writers and artists of 1920s and early 30s who were performing in the Soviet Ukraine and were afterwards executed or repressed by Stalin's totalitarian regime. Another one important term or phenomenon I'm going to talk is the Russian formal school. Just to remind you some main points. АПОЯС, Society for the Study of Poetic Language, изучение поэтического языка, that along with the Moscow Linguistic Circle was one of the prescriptive groups to Russian formalism. АПОЯС was formed in St. Petersburg in 1916. They oppose the biographical, psychological, and publicistic approaches to literary studies. The main question actually sounds like what makes literature being literature. The main terms they introduced were literary device, defamiliarization, the automatization of perception, texture in Russian factura, the distinction between plot and story, and later some formalists turned to the poem of so-called literary mores or литературный быт. The main members are Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Hinbaum, Yuri Tynyanov, Roman Yakovson, and from time to time it included Evgeny Polivanov, Leonid Yakubinsky, Osip Brik, Viktor Vinogradov, Viktor Zhengunsky, etc. To start with historical context, I would say first here on the map you can see that this green part is the part we are going to talk today, Soviet Ukraine, and here are the dates of including other territories during the further history of Ukraine. The development of Ukrainian culture in the first quarter of the 20th century. For the representatives of title nation of Russian Empire, most of the territory of modern Ukraine was, and probably still is, a kind of borderland. That's actually true in some sense because it is situated on the intersection of different languages, cultures, political traditions, especially if we have in mind a symbolic border between West and Russia, or even West and East, taken in a typical Orientalist way. This symbolical position on the edge determined the history of the region and its perception. The First World War, the Revolution 1917, and the Civil War on the territory of former Russian Empire led to the establishment of the brand new, previously unknown communist regime. By the 1920s, in the territory of modern Ukraine, there was a situation when local population had an opportunity to create an independent state. Here you can see first Ukrainian states after the First World War, the borders. So in 1918, the Western Ukrainian and Ukrainian People's Republic were proclaimed. Eventually, however, at the end of 1919, the Ukrainian Socialistic Soviet Republic was founded after the advance of Soviet-led army and defeat of the so-called Whites. The complex intersection of national and European history, the fact that after 1922 most of recent Ukrainian territory was the part of USSR, all this stipulated the simultaneous presence and development of several discourses in the Ukrainian culture, such as nationalist, European, Russian, imperial, and after Soviet. It should be noted here that this process was taking place in the political environment of the so-called Ukrainization, which was a part of the wider political strategy known as indigenization, Korenizatsiya, which had been accepted by party leaders in April 1923. The program assumed the increasing participation of native Ukrainians in the governmental system. The Ukrainian language got an official status in the Soviet Ukraine. So this political context served as an additional factor in the search for Ukrainian national identity that took place through cultural choice. So that's why for contemporary Ukrainians it's very important to talk about and to appeal to the culture of the 1920s. Another policy introduced in 1921 by Communist Party was the new economic policy, новая экономическая политика. The NEP represented a more market-oriented socialist economic policy and caused a lot of critiques from the left wing of the Communist Party and was marked by them as something negative. So the main problem of a new Soviet Ukraine culture in the 1920s was the relationship between the Russian imperial, high metropolitan culture based on the universal principles of any multinational empires in Western history, and national culture based on particularistic principles typical for any national culture of nations. The latter was for a long time existing under the control and the pressure of metropolitan culture and was endowed with the status of being second-rate and backward. At the beginning of 1920s, there was an urgent need to refresh the very idea of national culture in the new situation of Soviet regime and to mark its outlines and landmarks, as evidenced by the emergence of large number of literary groups. Each of them tried to assert its vision for further progress. So in other words, the problem of national content of literature, of cultural national identity, tradition and innovation, of the aesthetic and ideological landmarks has been so acute. So national Ukrainian culture of the beginning of 20th century turned out to be the main tool in national identity policy and in the process of nation building in the Ukraine after the First World War. Here is some literary groups that appeared during this period. So just in few words, 1921 appeared the futuristic organization as Panfood. They changed a lot afterwards their naming. That was led by Mikhail Semenko. The main representatives are Georg Kurupi, Nik Bajan, Oleg Sapoltratsky. Here I wanted just to indicate that the first futurist manifest that was called Myself, Some, was written by Semenko and published in 1914, just as like to make the history. In 1922, the Association of Peasant Writers Plug, or Ukrainian Plug, led by Sergei Pilipenko, was founded. The Association of Proletarian Writers Heart, headed by Vladimir Ilan Blakitny, was founded in 1923. A year later, literary group Lanka, headed by Mykola Zerov, appeared, kind of an important group because they were accused afterwards in formalism, and they, in Ukrainian discourse, they are called like neoclassics, neoclassiki, because they appeal to the forms of so-called classical tradition, like sonnets and so on. They pay attention to the form a lot. And in 1926, the Vaklitya Free Academy of Proletarian Literature was formed and organized by Mykola Khvylevy and Mike Johansson. And in 1925, Valerian Polishuk founded the literary group Avant-Garde. Just to indicate some context. So all this, there were numerous discussions on content and form on the content of national proletarian literature that start actually from 1919. And the formal theory served as an internal field for discussion about form and content. But from the second half of the 1920s, the intellectual vector of such discussion changed. And in the course of the literary discussion 1925-1928, the question of the content of Ukrainian proletarian literature became a focus along with the more sharply politicized thought. So here, if you maybe follow today, if you follow the contemporary Ukrainian media and the process connected with Euro integration, you can find a lot of articles naming like Europe now, psychological Europe now, or away from Moscow. Actually, these slogans are widely popular and like defines the geopolitical and cultural orientation of the contemporary Ukraine. So even like 100 years after, we still appeal to these ideas proclaimed by Khvylevy during this literary discussion. So the discussion had been held about some Khvylevy statements made in a series of his pamphlets. Here you may see Quo Vadis, Thoughts Upstream, Думки Протечі, The Apologies of Scribbling, Apologeti Писаризму, Ukraine or Lesser Rus, Україна чи Малоросія, 1926. One of the main participants in the discussion was the literary peasant group Plug, represented by its leader Sergei Pilipenko. He was defending the position of Marxism and popular education and literature, and on the contrary, Khvylevy's critique was aimed at education and Marxism and literature. Here I quote, "Workers and peasants could create the new art, only provided that they are intellectually gifted, talented, and brilliant people," unquote. Here we should also add that the position of the Plug would be compared with the position of the Napostovцы. From the title of their main printing organ, at Watch, Napostu, this group was in Soviet Russia, and they rejected the very possibility of politically neutral literature, insisting on unconditional support of the Communist Party, including the NEP, struggled against Populchiki, fellow travelers, and other proletarian organizations who didn't enter the BET, Old Russian Association of Proletarian Writers. In the first series of pamphlets, Quo Vadis, published 1925, Khvylevy formulated his main concepts such as Europe, proletarian art, and Asian Renaissance. Here he talks about Europe not as a geographical or political category, but a historical psychological phenomenon, where the figure of Goethe's Dr. Faust, one of the main Spengler's motifs, symbolizes a spirit of adventure, a source for knowledge and the precise cultural type. Here I quote, you have the quotation. Europe means an experience of many centuries. This is not that Europe that Spengler had declared as decline, not that rotting and which we detest. That is Europe of grandiose civilization, unquote. In the series of pamphlets of 1925, the question of the artistic and aesthetic landmarks of Ukrainian literature was not yet pointed out sharply. But Hvilovi, in his pamphlet Moscow Promised, Moskovsky Zadrypanki, published in March 1926, writes, probably I didn't get this, quotation. Ukrainian reality is more complicated than the Russian one. Because we face other problems, because we are in a young class of the young nations, because we are a young literature which has not yet had its Leo Tolstoys, which needs to have them, which is not in decline but on the rise. In this way it becomes clear why Ukraine is given a key role in the upcoming Asian Renaissance. Because Ukrainian culture, unlike Russian and European, which in the conception of Hvilovi was of the process of decline, has not yet had the phase of its revival. Starting from this point, the next question could be as follows. What kind of literature should Ukrainian society be oriented to? The answer is, in any case, not to the Russian culture. Quotation. Ukrainian poetry should run away from Russian literature and its poetics as quickly as possible. However, why to escape from an influence of Russian literature, not the others? Hvilovi provides the leader with the answer. The fact is that Russian literature is haunting us in the ages as the master of the situation. It taught our sight to be slavishly imitated. So to feed it in our young art means to delay its development. Our orientation is on Western European art, its styles and techniques. Moscow today is the center of the pan-Union Philistinism, unquote. In the relation to Opayas, Mykola Hvilovi and his followers take a similar position. On the one hand, formalism is rejected because it is an idealistic trend in art, whose root lies in the bourgeois worldview. But on the other hand, its terms and methods are used by them. Here I should know that these quotations from his first series of pamphlets, 1925, and it appeared after Trotsky's critique on formal method in Russia, and after Lenin's death. So it's like an important context here, where like formalism became to be indicated as bourgeois science. Quotation. Talking about Opayas, it's necessary to say, if we try to embody an idea in a work of art, we are often at a loss how to convey it. Here, in a certain sense, the formalists help us as a technical school. Neither do we follow the same path as Victor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, or Alexei Kruchony, nor do we follow it with vulgar Marxists. So, it's obvious that the expressed point of view indicates a very complex relationship with the imperial culture. On the one hand, we can see the reception of some ideas and concepts by the way of building them into another system. On the other hand, the effort to insulate oneself from the influences of Russian literature and culture is indicated here as well. Thus, Russian culture is rejected by Hvilovi because of its dominating status, which doesn't provide an opportunity to form a national, original, non-epigeneous literature. And secondly, because of the decline of Russian culture, whose Tolstoys are in the past already. No wonder that this position got the critique from the party authorities. So, in 1926, Stalin sent a special letter to Leonid Kaganovich, who was at that time the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Ukrainian SSSR, where he wrote, quotation, A wide movement for Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian public has begun and is growing in Ukraine. This movement, led by the non-communist intelligentsia at the local level, can manifest itself as the attempt to alienate Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian society from the old Soviet culture, to reveal in a manner of a struggle against Moscow as a whole, against the Russians, against Russian culture, and its highest achievement, Leninism. So, eventually, because of his views, Khiluvey had been accused in Ukrainian nationalism, and Vaplite, this organization, was dissolved in 1928, and after that, the Pan-Ukrainian Union of Proletarian Writers was founded. So it's like one case. Another case, I'm sorry for being patchwork, just I want to show you the paradigm, yeah? Another one case of establishing of not literary theory, but a kind of art theory. It was combined with futurist movement, whose leader was Mikhail Semenko. Probably you've heard this name. So in 1921, Semenko created the literary organization as Pan-Food, that is Pan-Futuristic Association. The program and theoretical aspects of which were set in the journal Semaphore у майбутнє and the newspaper Catafalque Mistets, Catafalque of Art, with the subtitle Everyday Journal of Pan-Futurist Deconstructors. So in few words, his conception includes such terms as construction and destruction. To create the new art, we have to destruct the old one and create a new one, meta art. So that would be the phase of construction. So he writes, new proletarian art that will be synthetic and constructive is possible to create only on the ruins of the old bourgeois art, which is the task of the destructive process. Here we could make the link to, for example, Lenin, who on 8th Congress Communist Party in 1919 was talking about the building of communists on the ruins of bourgeois culture. So, and if the terms construction and destruction were used by him to describe the dynamic of the development of art, then such terms as ideology and texture, factura, refer to art structure. Semenko rejects the dichotomy of form and content because they seem too narrow to him to build the meta theory. Here I quote, this system of form and content is closed and limited that resulted in casuistry and scholasticism, for example, formalism, on the one hand, and on the other, in refusing to solve the issue with the help of the concept of content. So what he suggests? He suggests to escape from this binary opposition, and he appeals to the term texture, which contains three elements: material, form, and content. Since the components of the texture are variable and vary from one type of art to another. So the material of poetry is the world, the complex of the verbal material, scene, composition, and stylistics refers to texture. So I don't have time to comment it. Yeah, just kind of a small briefly. So just here it's very important that he uses the formalist concepts such as texture and material that were introduced by Russian formalists, but he totally changes the meaning of these terms, and he like inputting them into another conception by just including them into another system. Another one case of establishing of Ukrainian literary theory. Just I wanted to show you some very important theoretical works on poetics that appeared during 1920s. It's just the books on poetics, because the number of these books and of articles that examine Ukrainian literature, I don't know, several hundreds. Yeah, just it seems to me that these one are important because they appeal to Russian formalist theory, and also they show the tendency how actually this contamination or relationship between formalism and Marxism works. So if we will check the work by Boris Yakubinsky that was published in 1922, we can find a lot of appeal to Russian formalist theory, and it wouldn't be so ideologized or politicized book as, for example, Happy Shamrai that was published in 1927, and he constructed the development of Ukrainian literature combining with, or from the point of view of Marxists. Here it's very important, or like a kind of interest. So Boris Yakubinsky's book got a review from Boris Tomaszewski that was published in Книга и революция in 1923, and it's very interesting that Tomaszewski in his review writes that Boris Yakubinsky built his conception on the examples of Russian poetry. That is totally untrue. I just checked it yesterday. So he gives the example from Ukrainian poetry of 19th century, Lesa Ukrainka, Ivan Franko, and so on. So here is just a small conclusion. So literature, as long as science, turned out to be an ideological tool for Soviet inner policy. That explains the main points of reception of Russian formalism in Soviet Ukrainian culture, and also sets a light on the emergence of Ukrainian literary theory. And the last one case that is very important in its correlation to Marxism, like the correlation between formalism and Marxism, is the visit of Boris Eichenbaum, who came to Kharkiv in 1923 and had 3 open lectures. The names of the lectures were What is the Formal Method? The Struggle for Literature, and one lecture was devoted to his brand new theory of literary wit, literary mores. Afterwards, his article that was called as the theory of formal method was translated into Ukrainian and published in the journal Червоний шлях in 1926. It was published with other articles of critiques, such critiques as Zakhary Chuchmarov. Chuchmarov is a very interesting example of Marxist psychology, and he talks from this point of view. Happy Shamrai talks, he was like close to formalist theory. He talks from the position of so-called philological critique. And the next 2 participants, Viktor Boyko and Anatoly Mashkin, they represent the Marxist camp. Just to say some words about, I just decided, as I don't have time, just decided to say some words about Viktor Boyko's reception of this article. It's because he indicates 4 main things of formalism. So the first thing is that formalists made a general and universal method from the partial and auxiliary device, according to the researcher of studying literature. Boyko defines the formal method as auxiliary for the mainstream revolutionary literary criticism and concludes, quotation, to be more precisely, it's one of the devices of the evolutionary method, unquote. Let us know that in his definition, Boyko proceeds from Leo Trotsky's criticism of the formal method. He implied quotation of party leader. Here is quote of Trotsky. By declaring a form as an essence of poetry, this school reduces its tasks to analyzing the etymological and syntactic properties of poetry. This is a partial work. Certainly, it's necessary and useful if we understand its partial auxiliary character. So, the second thing of the formalist Boyko sees in their discard of content. Here he refers to Plekhanov and Fritzsche. The next scene, formalist critique sees in the theory of complete independence of literature, so it's the theory of literary mores, introduced by Boris Eichenbaum. So Boyka sums up his article with a quite predictable question: are formalists friends or enemies to us? And he concludes, formalists become enemies of Marxism with their general theoretical arguments, their initial philosophical position, unquote. Here it's important to note that criticism of the formal method is concluded by Boyko in two directions: as an ideological platform that is hostile to Marxism, and as a sum of devices applicable to the study of a literary work. Therefore, according to the critique, Marxism must adapt some of formalist approaches in the field of literary study in order to strengthen its method. So, the conclusion. As a conclusion, we can consider these discussions as a sort of competition between two universalist approaches to literature, Marxism and formalism, a competition for the mainstream position in Soviet Ukrainian culture. Same struggle was happening in Moscow and Leningrad as well, but Ukrainian situation was profoundly different because of the presence of the third participant in this game, nationalism. But it's worth noticing that unlike Marxism and formalism, nationalism in the Ukrainian literature discussion of 1920s was playing rather a role of an atmosphere, of a cultural and ideological environment mixed with the expectations of Ukrainian intelligentsia, that being one of the active sides. In other words, nationalism was a background of the battle between Marxist ideology and modernist formalist theory. The most interesting feature of this situation is that all three approaches, Marxism, nationalism, and formalism, were the products of 19th century, the ideological and cultural outcomes of modernity as historical period. If in the first half of the 1920s these projects, each of them had a universalist vision of the place of literature in a system of social and political relations, so if in the first half of 1920s they still coexist as evidenced by the policy of Ukrainization and the new economic policy, the development of the avant-garde movement and the ability to lead open discussions, then from the mid of 1920s the aesthetic and pragmatic paradigms in Soviet art gradually began to merge into one version. From the end of the 1920s, both the national project and all the theories that competed with Marxism gradually ground to a halt. As a result, the diversity and multi-layered Soviet culture of the 1920s came to an end to be replaced by a more monolithic culture. The vector of the national politics changed. The participants of the discussions were forced to repent publicly. In 1934, the Union of Soviet Writers was created, and the method of socialist realism was proclaimed as the only method of Soviet literature. Thank you for your attention.
You mentioned that all three theories, formalism, nationalism, and Marxism, were product of the 19th century. But if you look at the really rich literature on formalism, we can take latest works by Ilya Kalinin, who finally published his beloved Shklovsky in a separate Собрание сочинений. They argue that it is precisely a product of the Russian Revolution and of the preceding this kind of conjunction of the First World War. So it is a product of the short 20th century, of its very beginning. That's my first question. And my second question, from your overall narrative, does it mean that formalism didn't really take root in Ukraine, or rather that Ukrainian scholars did not contribute to it? Because you mentioned precisely three reactions, which was just like boring on formalism for analysis of Ukrainian text, a rejection from Marxism, and kind of rejection with certain borrowings by nationalists. So there was no kind of Ukrainian contributions to this theory?
Could I answer from the second one? Yeah, actually, that is the main question that Ukrainians are very nervous about. So, while we are talking about the emergence of Ukrainian literary theory in the context of receiving ideas from Russia, as we don't want this context to be, of course, and this history is quite painful. And of course, there is a tendency, a huge tendency, that is last for probably the last. I would say more than 10 years, just to talk about Ukrainian literature and theory and culture in the context of European one as with a part of Europe. Yes, my point of view is that's why I began with the historical context. As when we are talking about Soviet Ukraine, it's a kind of one-way paradox situation, but we received, or maybe not paradox, logic situation, we received mostly of ideas we received from this side, from the Russian side. And yes, of course, we can indicate, and I can name you a lot of, I don't know, books that they appeal to, they translate. For example, Ukrainian futurists translated a lot from Czech Czechoslovakian poetry, German poetry, and so on. But the question is that I tried to show that all these cases I was talking about, they appeal to Russian formalists first, and then they appeal to other theory. And of course, if we are talking about the western part of Ukraine, it's like totally different situation. And for example, there is Mykola Rudnitsky, who in 1915 wrote the book called The Form and Idea, that was first published in 1932, unfortunately, but the first date he started to work on this book indicate that we received these ideas from German literature too, of course, just it's not the topic of my interest. So I indicate this correlation between Russian context and Ukrainian, because Russian context was more close, and in my opinion, it was more important than other contexts. So the next question is, yes, you're right. It's the question of how we indicate formalism and what we think under formalism. Here, when I was appealing to formalism in my conclusion, I meant not Russian formalism, I meant the formalism like the interest to the form, and the phenomenon of modernism that appeared in the 19th century.
Thank you.
Yes, I have also two questions, and one is related to the question before, because it seems to me that formalism and modernism are mixed up in a way, or at least they have a kind of ambiguity, maybe the same inherent contradiction as with the idea of the Asian Renaissance with the Western orientation. I mean, how can we make sense of that? And in the case of formalism and modernism, I mean, of course, they are overlapping, but I think it's the more important to distinguish also. So I didn't get your idea of modernism, really. This would be my first question. The other question is, you said the modernists came into conflict with the ideologists, the ideologists of Marxism. But isn't it a bit too general? I mean, you hinted at the letter of Stalin and the criticism of Troika, but I think we should keep in mind that at the time, mid-20s, you said these more orthodox ideology of Marxism was not a hegemony, didn't have a hegemony. I think a kind of formalism and also sociologist thinking with the class struggle, for example, was against this kind of orthodox understanding of Marxism in a way. So who are these, who is this group of ideologists? What do you mean by this?
Okay. So, like, to be short, because otherwise I had to explain a lot of things. Modernist. So formalism is the modernist phenomenon. Modernism. The question is, what is modernism? The question is, what is modernité? That's the historical time. Yeah. The question is, what is Marxism in its appropriation or its inversion in Ukraine, in Russia, or whether the same or different? And the question is, what is the correlation between modernism and Marxism? The correlation between modernism and Marxism at the beginning of the 20th century is the question of the correlation between ethics and ideology. Because Marxists struggled for the pure reality and modernists wanted to change reality too. That is the answer why, for example, a lot of modernists, Dadaists, they supported the revolution and they were Marxists. Because they liked this, not like it was the part of their worldview, just to change the reality. Just when it comes to so that's why, for example, Shklovsky supported and so on. But the point of no return is actually the Russian Revolution, where they understand that their ethics and ideological are the two different cases. So in this point, we see how modernists and Marxists they go like other way. So it's like one of the big questions, and it could be an interesting discussion. Just we don't have time. Who were they? So as I told, my heroes appeal to Bogdanov, Plekhanov, Trotsky, and Fritsch, Alexander Fritsch. So that were the heroes, the ideologists of Marxism, and like they were the same, probably the same context. Yes, they were important in Russia, same as in Ukraine, I would say so.
Yeah. Just one comment to that. I mean, the group you mentioned is not at all homogeneous. I mean, it's totally different ideas, right?
You mean in this sense? Yeah, of course.
I mean, what's the ideology then when the heroes have a totally different understanding? Fritsch is totally different from.
But they appeal actually to the ideas of Fritsch, Bogdanov, and Plekhanov, they appeal to culture. And I would say that the idea of communist or Marxist culture, or the place that fulfill, of the place that culture fulfill in Marxist conception, we can find a lot of similar positions between Fritsch, Plekhanov, and Bogdanov. I may not be right, but just as it seems to me, I would say that, like, yes, it would be in this sense, you could say. And also another one thing is that Marxism and its variation of Marx and Engels, they didn't have an interest to the function of culture. It wasn't actually the place or the topic they put attention to. So it was the implication of Russian Marxism to put the culture as the culture is the tool, of